The shadows of economic despair can reach further than any storm, touching lives, families, and the very fabric of society in ways that history sometimes struggles to fully capture. Imagine streets once bustling with optimism, now lined with shuttered stores, the laughter of children replaced by the hollow echo of uncertainty. The Great Depression was not merely a period of financial collapse, it was a profound human experience, a testament to both resilience and fragility. It was a time when hope was tested, communities were reshaped, and governments were forced to confront the limits of policy and intervention. Hello and welcome to The Other Side Stories. Here, we travel beyond the usual headlines to explore the untold tales of world history, mysteries, turning points, and hidden connections that shaped our planet. If you love discovering how the past still echoes in our present, you're in the right place. Let's uncover the other side of history together. The origins of the Great Depression are often traced to the exuberant 1920s, an era of apparent prosperity and rapid technological advancement. The Roaring Twenties, as it was fondly called, offered a vision of limitless potential. Skyscrapers pierced the skyline, jazz echoed from smoky nightclubs, and the automobile transformed the very geography of America. Consumer culture flourished, fueled by new methods of credit and installment purchasing. Yet, beneath this glittering surface lay cracks that would soon widen into a chasm. Overspeculation on the stock market, overproduction in agriculture and industry, and uneven wealth distribution created a precarious foundation. Banks extended credit recklessly, often lending more money than they could reasonably expect to recover. When confidence faltered, the collapse would be catastrophic. October 1929, specifically the infamous day known as Black Tuesday, marked the moment the stock market plummeted with unprecedented ferocity. Millions of investors watched in horror as billions of dollars vanished seemingly overnight. The immediate impact was dramatic. Panic swept across the nation, people rushed to withdraw their savings, and banks, unable to honor the surge of demands, began to fail. Yet the crisis was more than just a financial calamity. It reflected structural weaknesses that had been silently building throughout the decade. Factories began laying off workers, farms faced plummeting crop prices, and the ripple effects spread like wildfire. By the early 1930s, unemployment rates soared to nearly a quarter of the American workforce, and families who had once considered themselves secure were suddenly teetering on the brink of poverty. The human toll of the Depression is often captured in photographs of breadlines, dust-strewn towns, and children staring through broken windows. These images, while striking, can only hint at the personal anguish experienced in countless households. Families often faced impossible choices: to keep their homes or to feed their children, to maintain dignity or to accept charity. Men who had once been the providers for their families found themselves wandering in search of work, sometimes for weeks or months at a time. Women, too, were affected, some forced into low-paying labor, others finding innovative ways to stretch meager resources to keep their families alive. Communities that had once been tightly knit found themselves fraying under the pressures of scarcity. Yet, in some cases, the crisis fostered extraordinary acts of solidarity and mutual aid. While the United States was the epicenter of the Depression, the economic collapse was global. International trade contracted dramatically, with countries around the world experiencing declines in industrial production and skyrocketing unemployment. Nations that had loaned heavily to Europe after World War I suddenly faced defaults and financial strain. Countries like Germany and Britain saw economic instability intensify political extremism, contributing to social unrest and, in some cases, the rise of authoritarian regimes. The Depression thus not only reshaped the economic landscape, but also influenced the political trajectory of the 1930s, setting the stage for events that would culminate in World War II. The policy responses to the Depression were as varied as they were controversial. In the United States, President Herbert Hoover initially adhered to principles of limited government intervention, advocating for voluntary cooperation among businesses and local relief efforts. Critics, however, argued that these measures were insufficient in the face of such a widespread crisis. As unemployment deepened and social discontent grew, the limitations of laissez-faire economics became increasingly apparent. In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt assumed the presidency and embarked on an ambitious series of programs collectively known as the New Deal. These initiatives aimed to provide relief to the destitute, spur economic recovery, and reform financial institutions to prevent future collapses. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, and Social Security left lasting legacies, reshaping the relationship between citizens and the federal government. Yet the New Deal was not without its critics. Some argued that government intervention stifled individual initiative and prolonged economic dependency. Others contended that the measures were insufficiently bold, failing to fully address systemic inequalities or revive private enterprise rapidly enough. The debate over the New Deal highlights a fundamental tension in economic policy, balancing immediate relief with long-term structural reform. The era also prompted a reconsideration of monetary and fiscal policy, including the abandonment of the gold standard in the United States and other countries, which allowed for more flexible economic management. The Great Depression also left profound cultural and social imprints. Literature, film, and music of the era often reflected the despair, resilience, and hope that characterized daily life. Writers like John Steinbeck captured the plight of displaced farmers in works such as The Grapes of Wrath, while photographers for the Farm Security Administration documented the stark realities of rural poverty. Music, from blues to folk to jazz, provided both solace and commentary, articulating the struggles and aspirations of ordinary people. These cultural artifacts remain vital windows into the lived experience of the Depression, reminding us that history is not solely the story of numbers and policies, but of human lives navigating extraordinary adversity. In examining the causes of the Depression, it is important to consider the interconnection between agriculture, industry, and finance. Farmers faced falling prices due to overproduction and declining international demand, which in turn affected banks that had lent heavily to the agricultural sector. Industrial overproduction, coupled with underconsumption, led to factory closures and layoffs. The stock market crash was thus both a symptom and an accelerant of deeper economic imbalances. Furthermore, international trade policies, including tariffs and protectionist measures, often exacerbated the crisis by restricting markets for exports, deepening global interdependence. The interplay of these factors underscores the complexity of economic systems, where a shock in one sector can cascade into widespread disruption. The psychological impact of the Depression was equally profound. Economic insecurity fostered anxiety, hopelessness, and social tension. Suicide rates in many affected countries increased, reflecting the despair that accompanied financial ruin. Children faced malnutrition and interrupted education, shaping a generation with formative experiences of hardship. Yet, adversity also fostered ingenuity, as families developed coping strategies ranging from bartering networks to home-based crafts and enterprises. The collective memory of these hardships would influence social and political attitudes for decades, embedding a cautiousness towards speculative risk and an appreciation for the social safety net. Women's experiences during the Depression were multifaceted. While men were more likely to be formally employed, women often carried the burden of domestic survival, stretching limited resources and supplementing income through informal labor such as laundry, childcare, or piecework. In some cases, societal norms discouraged women from entering paid employment, creating additional tension within households. However, the period also saw early shifts in gender roles and public policy, including initiatives to support women's employment and social welfare. The narratives of women during the Depression are crucial for understanding the full spectrum of human experience in times of crisis. Urban and rural communities faced distinct challenges. In cities, unemployment and housing instability created visible hardship, from breadlines to shantytowns, often called Hoovervilles. In rural areas, environmental disasters compounded economic distress. The Dust Bowl, a severe drought affecting the Great Plains, forced countless families to abandon farms and migrate westward in search of work and sustenance. These migrations reshaped a demographic landscape of the United States, influencing patterns of settlement, labor, and culture. They also underscored the vulnerability of communities to intertwined environmental and economic forces. The Depression catalyzed transformations in labor relations. Workers facing layoffs and wage cuts increasingly organized to demand rights, protection, and representation. Strikes, protests, and the rise of labor unions became defining features of the decade, challenging traditional power structures in both industry and government. Legislation emerging from the New Deal, including the National Labor Relations Act, helped formalize collective bargaining and provided legal protections that endure to this day. The era thus not only reshaped the economy, but the dynamics of work and social justice. Global perspectives illuminate the interconnectedness of the Depression. In Europe, nations faced economic contraction, political unrest, and the stabilization of post-World War I recovery. Germany, burdened by reparations and already experiencing political polarization, saw the economic crisis amplify extremist movements, paving the way for the rise of Adolf Hitler. The lingering effects of the Depression were evident not only in material conditions, but also in cultural expression. Literature, film, and the arts became mirrors, reflecting both suffering and resilience. Photographers like Dorothea Lange captured haunting images of migrant families and struggling farmers, revealing the intimate realities behind economic statistics. Writers, including John Steinbeck, whose The Grapes of Wrath immortalized the plight of the Dust Bowl migrants, depicted the human cost of systemic failure with unparalleled empathy. In theaters and cinemas, audiences sought both escapism and commentary, with films portraying both social critique and the persistence of hope. The Depression shaped the narratives of a generation, embedding lessons about endurance, inequality, and the consequences of unchecked speculation. The economic dislocation also reshaped family dynamics. Households were forced to adapt to new realities, with extended families often pooling resources. Children faced curtailed education and labor exploitation in some cases, yet these hardships often fostered resilience and innovation. Communities, though strained, discovered informal networks of support. Neighbors shared food, bartered goods, or offered temporary housing to those displaced. Churches, charitable organizations, and local governments expanded their roles, providing relief that the federal government could not yet fully address. Social cohesion was tested, and in many places, the Depression catalyzed a renewed sense of communal responsibility alongside deep social anxieties. Internationally, the Depression highlighted vulnerabilities in global economic systems. Countries reliant on exports or foreign loans found themselves particularly exposed. In Germany, economic instability fueled political radicalization, facilitating the rise of the Nazi Party and foreshadowing a broader geopolitical upheaval. In Latin America, commodity price collapses led to social unrest and experiments in state-led economic intervention. Even in nations that weathered the Depression relatively well, the experience prompted new thinking about economic policy, central banking, and international trade. The interconnected nature of the crisis underscored that local economic policies could have far-reaching consequences in an increasingly globalized system. The banking crisis of the early 1930s remains one of the most striking episodes of the Depression. With the collapse of thousands of banks, depositors lost life savings, further eroding confidence in financial institutions. This widespread failure necessitated reforms such as the establishment of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, which guaranteed deposits and aimed to restore trust in the banking system. Similarly, the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, was created to regulate the stock market and prevent the kinds of speculative excesses that had contributed to the 1929 crash. These institutions reflected a recognition that stability required oversight, transparency, and public trust, lessons that continue to influence financial regulation today. The Depression also precipitated shifts in political thought and leadership. In the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal not only addressed immediate needs, but also redefined the role of government in society. Social programs, public works projects, and regulatory reforms embodied a philosophy that economic security was a collective responsibility. Globally, leaders confronted similar dilemmas, balancing austerity with stimulus, navigating social social unrest and preventing extremist movements from exploiting economic despair. These challenges illustrated that economic crises are not only financial phenomena, but also profound tests of governance, ideology, and social cohesion. Labor movements gained strength during the Depression, asserting demands for fair wages, job security, and collective bargaining rights. Strikes and labor protests became more frequent, reflecting the growing frustration of workers who faced not only job loss but declining standards of living. In response, governments increasingly recognized labor rights as integral to social stability, codifying protections that would have enduring impacts. These developments underscored the centrality of work in personal dignity and social structure, and they highlighted the potential of organized labor to influence policy and society in times of crisis. The Depression's impact on agriculture was particularly severe. Farmers contended with falling commodity prices, mounting debt, and environmental disasters like the Dust Bowl. Many lost their land, becoming migrants in search of work, food, and stability. These migrations reshaped demographic patterns, as communities in the West absorbed waves of displaced families. The federal government responded with programs such as the Agricultural Adjustment Act, designed to stabilize prices and reduce surplus production. While controversial, these interventions reflected an evolving understanding of economic interdependence. The plight of one sector could not be isolated from the health of the broader economy. The social consequences of the Depression were equally profound. Widespread unemployment and poverty contributed to shifts in public attitudes, including greater support for social safety nets and government intervention. Cultural expressions, from literature to music to visual arts, reflected both the harsh realities and the enduring hope of affected populations. Communities developed innovative coping mechanisms, including barter networks, cooperative ventures, and mutual aid societies. These strategies illustrated the adaptability of human societies, revealing both the fragility and resilience in social structures. Education suffered during the Depression as well. With families struggling to afford school supplies, tuition, or basic sustenance, dropout rates increased. Children often worked to supplement family income, sometimes in hazardous conditions. However, these challenges also fostered a generation attuned to economic realities, practical problem solving, and community interdependence. Educational institutions adapted, incorporating programs that addressed nutrition, vocational training, and adult education. The period highlighted the interplay between economic conditions and social development, demonstrating that crises leave enduring marks on human capital and societal progress. The cultural landscape of the 1930s reflected a rich tapestry of response to hardship. Music, from blues to folk, conveyed both despair and perseverance, giving voice to those whose experiences were often invisible in economic statistics. Cinema offered escape, commentary, and sometimes propaganda, shaping public perception and reinforcing shared narratives of struggle and resilience. Literature chronicled suffering, challenged assumptions, and questioned societal structures, while visual arts captured the stark reality of daily life. These cultural artifacts remain enduring testimonies to human creativity and endurance under pressure, illustrating how adversity can catalyze profound artistic expression. The Depression also catalyzed advances in economic thought. Economists like John Maynard Keynes challenged prevailing orthodoxies, advocating for government intervention to manage aggregate demand and mitigate cyclical downturns. Keynesian economics, emphasizing fiscal stimulus and public investment, gained traction in response to the apparent inadequacies of laissez-faire policies. This intellectual shift reshaped policy debates, informing responses not only to the Depression but to future economic crises. The era thus represents a critical juncture, not only in human experience but also in the development of modern economic theory. Global economic policy underwent transformation during the Depression. International monetary systems, trade agreements, and fiscal strategies were reconsidered in light of widespread collapse. Countries abandoned the gold standard to regain monetary flexibility, instituted protectionist measures, and experimented with stimulus programs. The interconnected nature of the global economy meant that decisions in one nation could have ripple effects worldwide. These dynamics underscored the importance of coordination, foresight, and adaptability in international economic governance, lessons that remain relevant in contemporary policymaking. Urban landscapes were dramatically altered by the Depression. Cities faced housing shortages, unemployment, and social unrest. Yet, they also became sites of innovation and community organization. Public works projects under the New Deal, including the construction of roads, bridges, schools, and parks, reshaped urban infrastructure while providing employment. These initiatives not only addressed immediate economic needs, but also laid the foundation for long-term development. Urban centers became laboratories for policy, demonstrating the interplay between physical space, social structures, and economic recovery. Rural America faced distinct challenges, compounded by environmental factors. The Dust Bowl epitomized the intersection of ecological disaster and economic hardship. Severe drought, combined with unsustainable farming practices, created clouds of dust that devastated crops, homes, and livelihoods. Thousands of families migrated westward, seeking opportunities and stability. These migrations reshaped demographic patterns, influenced labor markets, and prompted policy responses aimed at soil conservation, agricultural relief, and community stabilization. The experience highlighted the vulnerability of human settlements to environmental forces and the necessity of adaptive management in sustaining economic and social systems. The Depression's influence on politics extended beyond economics. In the United States, debates over the scope and role of federal government reached unprecedented intensity. Roosevelt's New Deal faced both support and opposition, reflecting ideological divisions over state intervention, individual responsibility, and social welfare. Globally, economic instability fueled the rise of extremist movements, challenged democratic institutions, and reshaped international relations. The period illustrates how economic crises can catalyze political transformation, testing governance structures and societal norms. The impact of the Great Depression on everyday life was profound, reshaping the routines, aspirations, and social expectations of millions. In households across the United States, families adopted frugality as a way of life. Meals were stretched, clothing repaired and patched, and leisure curtailed. Many families relied on community networks or charity, often turning to churches, local relief organizations, or even neighbors for assistance. Children, too, were not immune. Many left school to work in farms, factories, or informal labor to supplement household income. These experiences left lasting impressions on the values, habits, and resilience of the generation that lived through the decade. The labor landscape during the Depression was marked by instability and increasing organization. Millions were unemployed, and those fortunate enough to retain work often faced wage cuts and reduced hours. Labor strikes became more frequent, asserting the rights of workers in the face of widespread hardship. The rise of unions, combined with legislative protections under New Deal reforms, such as the National Labor Relations Act, redefined the relationship between employers, workers, and government. These developments had enduring effects on labor relations, setting precedents for collective bargaining and worker protections that persist to this day. The agricultural sector, meanwhile, faced a crisis that combined both economic and environmental pressures. Farmers, already contending with falling crop prices due to overproduction and decreased demand, were devastated by ecological disasters such as the Dust Bowl. The combination of drought, wind erosion, and poor farming practices transformed fertile land into dust-choked wastelands, forcing entire communities to relocate. Migration patterns shifted, particularly toward California and other western states, creating tensions between newcomers and established residents. This mass displacement exposed the fragility of rural life and highlighted the interconnectedness of environmental stewardship and economic stability. The Depression's global repercussions demonstrated the interconnectedness of modern economies. Countries dependent on exports suffered as international demand collapsed, exacerbating domestic unemployment and social unrest. In Germany, economic collapse provided fertile ground for extremist politics, contributing to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Britain and France struggled with rising unemployment and austerity, while nations in Latin America and Asia implemented protective economic measures but reshaped trade patterns. These global dynamics underscored the vulnerability of interdependent economies to systemic shocks and the importance of coordinated responses to financial crises. Financial reforms became central to recovery efforts. In the United States, thousands of bank failures during the early 1930s revealed the vulnerabilities of the banking system. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, was created to protect depositors, restore confidence, and stabilize financial institutions. Similarly, the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, was established to regulate stock markets, enforce transparency, and prevent speculative excesses that had contributed to the crash of 1929. These reforms reflected a recognition that economic stability required institutional safeguards, regulatory oversight, and public trust. The cultural and artistic expressions of the Depression era were shaped by both hardship and resilience. Literature chronicled social injustice, economic suffering, and the endurance of ordinary people. John Steinbeck's novels captured the struggles of farmers and migrant workers, while photographers such as Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans immortalized the faces of those affected by poverty and displacement. Music, theater, and film provided both solace and commentary, offering narratives that blended despair, hope, and critique. These cultural artifacts continue to inform our understanding of the human dimensions of economic crisis, reminding us that the story of the Depression is as much about people as it is about policy or numbers. Education during the Depression faced significant challenges. With families struggling financially, many children left school to contribute to household income. Schools faced budget cuts, teacher layoffs, and reduced resources, affecting both curriculum and access. Nonetheless, some innovative programs emerged, offering vocational training, adult education, and nutrition initiatives to mitigate the impact of economic hardship. These adaptations highlighted the critical relationship between economic conditions and social development, emphasizing that educational systems are deeply intertwined with the broader societal context. Women's roles evolved under the pressures of the Depression. While traditional gender norms often discouraged women from seeking formal employment, necessity drove many into the workforce, often in low-paying or informal positions. Women managed households under severe constraints, engaged in home-based enterprises, and participated in community support networks. Policy interventions, such as New Deal programs, provided avenues for employment, social support, and civic engagement. The experiences of women during this era reveal the intersection of gender, economics, and social policy, offering insights into the evolution of societal norms under pressure. Urban life was transformed by the economic collapse. Cities faced housing shortages, unemployment, and the proliferation of shantytowns, known satirically after President Hoover. Public works projects, such as those under the Works Progress Administration, WPA, provided employment while reshaping infrastructure, including roads, bridges, schools, and parks. Urban centers became laboratories for policy, illustrating how physical space, economic planning, and social welfare could intersect to address human needs during crises. These efforts not only alleviated immediate suffering, but also left lasting legacies in the built environment. The intersection of environmental and economic crises was starkly visible in the rural Midwest. The Dust Bowl, caused by a combination of drought, overcultivation, and poor soil management, decimated farmland and displaced thousands of families. The ecological disaster forced migrations westward, particularly to California, creating social tension and economic competition in host communities. Federal interventions, including soil conservation programs and agricultural subsidies, sought to stabilize the affected regions. These responses illustrated the necessity of integrating environmental management into economic planning and highlighted the vulnerability of human societies to ecological disruption. Political discourse during the Depression was dominated by debates over the role of government, the limits of free markets, and social responsibility. In the United States, Roosevelt's New Deal embodied a philosophy that economic security and social welfare were collective responsibility. Opponents argued that these programs stifled individual initiative and expanded government power excessively. Globally, economic distress catalyzed political extremism, leading to authoritarian regimes in some nations and fostering social reform movements in others. The Depression underscored the deep link between economic conditions and political stability, demonstrating that financial crises can reshape governance and public ideology. The evolution of labor relations during this decade was profound. Unemployed and underemployed workers organized, demanded rights, and challenged existing hierarchies. Strikes and protests became common as workers sought protection, fair wages, and collective bargaining power. Legislation emerging from New Deal reforms, including the National Labor Relations Act, codified worker rights and created institutional mechanisms for negotiation. These transformations reflected an evolving understanding of social justice and a recognition that economic systems must balance capital and labor to maintain stability. Agriculture's challenges were exacerbated by both market forces and environmental degradation. Falling commodity prices left farmers unable to repay debts, while drought and soil erosion decimated productivity. The Agricultural Adjustment Act attempted to stabilize prices by limiting production, while conservation programs sought to rehabilitate the land. These interventions highlighted the interdependence of economic, environmental, and social systems. Farmers' migration in search of better opportunities reshaped regional demographics and labor markets, illustrating how economic crises can influence human mobility and societal structure. The social fabric of the Depression era was tested in myriad ways. Families, communities, and institutions faced unprecedented strain. Mutual aid networks, informal support systems, and charitable organizations became critical in sustainable daily life. Communities developed innovative methods to cope with scarcity, from bartering goods to communal food preparation. The crisis also prompted reflection on social responsibility, government intervention, and the moral obligations of individuals and institutions during times of collective hardship. The psychological impact of prolonged economic hardship cannot be overstated. Anxiety, despair, and uncertainty permeated daily life. Suicide rates increased, stress-related illnesses were prevalent, and mental health services were often inaccessible. Yet the era also revealed resilience, creativity, and adaptation. Communities and individuals developed coping mechanisms, relied on social bonds, and demonstrated remarkable resourcefulness in the face of adversity. These experiences left indelible marks on the collective consciousness, influencing attitudes towards savings, employment, and governmental responsibility for generations to come. Global effects of the Depression demonstrated the fragility of interconnected economies. Countries dependent on exports or foreign investment were particularly vulnerable. Germany's economic collapse intensified. As the 1930s progressed, the United States began to see the early signs of recovery, though the path was uneven and fraught with challenges. Industrial production slowly increased, some sectors rebounded, and unemployment, while still high, began to decline. Federal programs under the New Deal continued to expand, employing millions in public works projects and offering direct assistance to those most in need. Yet, the psychological and social scars of the Depression persisted. People who had experienced unemployment, loss of savings, or home foreclosure remained cautious in their spending and investment behaviors. The crisis had fundamentally reshaped the relationship between citizens and the economy, leaving a generation more wary of speculative excesses and more receptive to government intervention in times of hardship. The New Deal's impact extended far beyond immediate economic relief. Social Security, established in 1935, represented a profound shift in public policy, ensuring that the elderly, disabled, and unemployed could access a basic level of financial security. Labor protections and collective bargaining rights redefined workplace relationships, giving workers a voice and codifying mechanisms for resolving disputes. Infrastructure projects transformed the physical landscape of the nation, creating roads, schools, bridges, and parks that would serve generations to come. These programs collectively reflected a recognition that recovery required both immediate action and structural reform, addressing the roots of economic vulnerability as well as the symptoms. The Depression also intensified debates about economic ideology. Critics of the New Deal feared an expansion of federal power that could stifle individual initiative, while supporters argued that bold government action was necessary to avert social collapse. Globally, debates over protectionism, monetary policy, and social welfare played out across national governments. In some countries, economic hardship fueled the rise of totalitarian regimes, while in others, it spurred reform movements aimed at expanding social safety nets and democratizing economic opportunity. These debates underscore that economic crises are rarely neutral. They force societies to confront questions about equity, responsibility, and the balance between individual freedom and collective well-being. Cultural expression during the Depression offered a window into the lived experience of the era. Artists, writers, and musicians captured the tension between despair and resilience, often highlighting both suffering and hope. Photographers documented the faces of those affected by unemployment, displacement, and poverty, providing enduring visual testimony to human endurance. Literature explored themes of social injustice, migration, and family struggle, while film offered both escapism and social commentary. Music, from folk ballads to jazz, reflected the emotional landscape of the time, giving voice to communities navigating hardship. Collectively, these cultural artifacts demonstrate how art serves as both documentation and interpretation, shaping our understanding of historical experience. Education and youth during the Depression were profoundly affected. Schools faced budget cuts, overcrowding, and limited resources, forcing difficult choices about staffing and programming. Children were often required to contribute to family income, curtailing educational opportunities. Despite these challenges, some innovative programs emerged, including vocational training, nutritional assistance, and adult education initiatives, which sought to mitigate the impact of economic hardship. The experiences of young people during the Depression illustrate the deep connections between economic conditions, social development, and generational trajectories, showing how crises shape not only immediate outcomes but long-term societal patterns. Women navigated the Depression with resilience, balancing household management, child-rearing, and, in many cases, employment. While societal norms sometimes constrained formal employment opportunities, necessity drove women into work, often in low-paying or informal sectors. Women's labor, both paid and unpaid, was critical to family survival, demonstrating the central role of domestic and community labor in economic resilience. Policy initiatives, including those under the New Deal, gradually expanded support for women, though disparities remained. The experiences of women during this era highlight intersections of gender, economics, and policy, offering important insights into the social dimensions of economic crises. Urban centers bore the brunt of economic collapse, yet they also became sites of adaptation and experimentation. Shantytowns, colloquially known as Hooverville, appeared in cities across the country, providing improvised shelter for the displaced. Public works projects under the WPA and other programs offered employment while reshaping urban infrastructure, from roads and bridges to schools and public buildings. Cities became laboratories for policy, demonstrating the potential of coordinated governmental action to address both material and social needs. These interventions left lasting legacies in urban planning and public administration, illustrating the potential of policy to transform both lives and landscapes. Rural America faced compounding challenges, particularly in the Great Plains. The Dust Bowl, an environmental catastrophe fueled by drought and unsustainable farming practices, devastated farmland, destroyed homes, and displaced entire communities. The resulting migrations, particularly to western states such as California, created both opportunities and social tensions. Federal programs aimed to stabilize the agricultural economy and rehabilitate the land, combining financial assistance with conservation initiatives. These efforts underscore the inseparability of environmental stewardship and economic sustainability, highlighting lessons that remain relevant in contemporary agricultural policy. Political discourse during the Depression reflected deep ideological divides. In the United States, Roosevelt's New Deal was lauded for providing relief and structural reform, but also criticized for expanding the scope of federal authority. Globally, nations faced similar dilemmas, with economic collapse spurring extremism in some regions and reformist policies in others. The Depression illustrated how economic crises can catalyze political transformation, challenging governance structures and forcing societies to reconsider the relationship between state, market, and citizenry. The debates and decisions of this era continue to inform policymaking and economic philosophy. Labor relations underwent significant transformation during the 1930s. Workers increasingly organized to demand fair wages, job security, and representation. Strikes and labor protests became more frequent as the economic pressures intensified. Legislative reforms, including the National Labor Relations Act, formalized protections for collective bargaining, reshaping employer-employee relationships. These developments emphasize the importance of balancing capital and labor for societal stability, demonstrating how crises can catalyze institutional and legal evolution in support of social justice. The agricultural sector's transformation was critical to understanding the broader economic landscape. Falling prices, mounting debts, and environmental degradation left farmers vulnerable. The Agricultural Adjustment Act attempted to stabilize prices and reduce overproduction, while soil conservation programs sought to prevent future ecological disasters. Migration patterns resulting from agricultural collapse reshaped demographic and labor distribution, influencing urban development and social dynamics. These interconnections between economy, environment, and society highlight the complexity of policy responses to crises and the necessity of integrated approaches to recovery. Social cohesion was both tested and reinforced during the Depression. Families, neighbors, and communities faced unprecedented strain, yet informal networks of support often emerged, offering food, shelter, and mutual aid. Charitable organizations, religious institutions, and local governments played critical roles in sustaining daily life. The era illustrates how social resilience can complement formal policy responses, demonstrating the interplay between informal and institutional mechanisms in maintaining societal stability during economic turmoil. The psychological impact of prolonged hardship shaped behaviors and attitudes for decades. Anxiety, despair, and uncertainty permeated daily life. Suicide rates and mental health crises rose, reflecting the human cost of economic instability. Yet, adversity also revealed resilience and ingenuity as individuals and communities developed coping strategies, leveraged social bonds, and adapted creatively to scarcity. These experiences left lasting imprints on financial habits, social expectations, and cultural narratives, influencing generations long after the immediate crisis subsided. Global ramifications of the Depression underscored the interconnectedness of modern economies. Countries reliant on exports or foreign capital were particularly vulnerable. Germany's economic turmoil facilitated political extremism, while other nations grappled with social unrest and protective economic policies. The Depression demonstrated that economic crises can transcend borders, influencing political, social, and cultural development internationally. The lessons of interconnected vulnerability remain salient in today's globalized economy, where shocks in one region can rapidly propagate worldwide. Economic thought evolved dramatically in response to the Depression. The failures of laissez-faire policies prompted the embrace of Keynesian principles, emphasizing government intervention to stabilize demand and promote employment. Fiscal and monetary tools became central to managing economic cycles, influencing both recovery efforts and long-term economic governance. The period illustrates the dynamic relationship between lived experience, policy experimentation. By the late 1930s, the United States and much of the world had begun to recover from the worst effects of the Great Depression, yet the scars of the decade remained visible. Unemployment had decreased, industrial production was rising, and international trade slowly resumed. However, the lessons of the Depression had fundamentally altered both policy and perception. Governments recognized that economic stability required oversight, regulation, and social safeguards to protect citizens from the vulnerabilities exposed by systemic collapse. The era had demonstrated that prosperity was neither inevitable nor universally shared, and that markets alone could not ensure social well-being. The cultural and social legacy of the Depression persisted long after economic indicators improved. Families continued to value frugality, savings, and careful planning, habits forged during years of scarcity. Communities maintained networks of mutual aid and solidarity developed during the crisis. Literature, art, and music continued to reflect the struggles and triumphs of ordinary people, preserving the memory of hardship and resilience. These cultural touchstones became part of the collective consciousness, shaping attitudes, narratives, and values for generations that followed. Politically, the Depression had expanded the expectations placed on governments. Citizens increasingly looked to public institutions for protection, relief, and guidance during times of crisis. Social programs implemented during the New Deal, such as Social Security and unemployment insurance, became enduring features of the American social contract. Similarly, financial reforms, including banking regulations and stock market oversight, set precedents for the role of government in safeguarding economic stability. The Depression had transformed notions of citizenship, rights, and responsibilities, embedding expectations that would influence policy debates for decades. The international effects of the Depression continued to resonate. In Europe, economic instability contributed to political polarization, the rise of totalitarian regimes, and ultimately the outbreak of World War II. In Latin America and Asia, governments implemented protectionist measures, state-led industrialization programs, and social reforms to buffer populations against market shocks. These responses highlighted the varied strategies nations employed to address the same global phenomenon, reflecting differences in political systems, resources, and social structures. The Depression illustrated the interplay between domestic policy and international forces, showing how local crises can ripple across the globe. Urban development during the Depression left tangible marks on the physical and social landscape. Public works projects not only provided employment, but also modernized infrastructure, building schools, roads, bridges, and public buildings that endure today. Urban planning incorporated lessons learned from the crisis, including the importance of housing, sanitation, and civic amenities. Cities became laboratories for innovation in policy, design, and social programming, demonstrating the potential for economic stimulus to intersect with public welfare and long-term development. Rural life, meanwhile, had been transformed by both environmental and economic challenges. The Dust Bowl exemplified the consequences of unsustainable agricultural practices combined with climatic stress. Federal interventions, including soil conservation programs and agricultural subsidies, sought to restore both land and livelihoods. Migratory patterns shifted as displaced farmers moved westward in search of opportunity, reshaping demographics and labor markets. These movements influenced social relations, labor organization, and regional culture, highlighting the profound ways in which economic crises can reshape human geography. Labor and industry underwent lasting change. The Depression catalyzed stronger unionization, worker protections, and recognition of labor rights. Collective bargaining became institutionalized, strikes and protests influenced policy, and new legislation codified standards for wages, working hours, and workplace safety. These developments altered the balance of power between employers, employees, and government, demonstrating how economic crises can drive systemic social change and redefine workplace norms. Education and youth continued to reflect the Depression's legacy. Children and young adults whose schooling was interrupted by economic necessity carried lessons of resilience into adulthood. Schools adapted curricula to provide vocational training and practical skills, while federal programs addressed nutrition and access to education. These innovations not only mitigated immediate hardship, but also prepared a generation to participate in economic recovery and future growth, illustrating the interplay between crisis, adaptation, and social investment. Women's roles were permanently affected by the decade's challenges. The necessity of managing households under severe constraint, engaging in work outside the home, and participating in community support networks broadened social expectations and redefined gender norms. Policy measures under the New Deal and other initiatives provided pathways for women's economic participation and social engagement, albeit within the limits of prevailing societal attitudes. The Depression catalyzed shifts in the perception of women's capabilities and responsibilities, laying groundwork for future social change. The psychological imprint of the Depression was enduring. The experience of loss, uncertainty, and prolonged hardship shaped attitudes towards money, risk, and social security. Individuals and families adopted caution, frugality, and planning strategies that influenced consumer behavior and investment decisions for decades. Communities retained a heightened awareness of vulnerability and interdependence, fostering both resilience and conservatism in social and economic practices. These psychological legacies underscored that economic crises leave enduring marks beyond material and policy outcomes. Culturally, the Depression left a rich legacy. Art, literature, photography, music, and film preserved the narratives of hardship, adaptation, and resilience. Stories of migrant workers, urban families, and displaced communities became embedded in national and global consciousness. These cultural artifacts not only document history, but also offer insights into human behavior, societal values, and the creative response to adversity. The Depression demonstrated that even in periods of despair, human imagination and expression flourish, leaving legacies that inform and inspire future generations. Financial and economic thought evolved substantially. Keynesian economics gained prominence, emphasizing the necessity of government intervention to stabilize demand and mitigate economic cycles. Fiscal stimulus, public investment, and social spending became accepted tools for managing economic uncertainty. Regulatory frameworks, including banking regulations and stock market oversight, reflected a recognition of systemic vulnerability and the need for safeguards. These intellectual and practical shifts reshaped policy not only in the United States, but around the world, influencing approaches to economic management throughout the 20th century. The Great Depression's global consequences were profound. Countries across Europe, Asia, and Latin America confronted unemployment, social unrest, and political instability. Protectionist policies, state-led industrialization programs, and social reforms became common strategies to address the crisis. In Germany, economic hardship contributed to political extremism and the rise of the Nazi regime. In other regions, governments experimented with reforms designed to stabilize economies and maintain social cohesion. The Depression illustrated the interplay between domestic policy and international forces, showing how local crises can ripple across the globe. Urban and rural transformations reflected the interplay between policy, economy, and human adaptation. Cities rebuilt through public works programs, while rural regions faced ecological and economic rehabilitation. Housing, transportation, education, and labor infrastructure were reshaped, leaving legacies that endured well beyond the Depression itself. Communities adapted socially and culturally, forging networks of support and resilience. These transformations highlight the capacity of societies to navigate profound systemic shocks, balancing immediate survival with long-term development. Politically, the Depression also reshaped political landscapes. Debates over government intervention, social welfare, and economic responsibility influenced electoral outcomes, policy priorities, and ideological alignments. Roosevelt's New Deal represented a paradigm shift, redefining the role of the federal government in economic and social life. Internationally, economic crises contributed to political instability, extremism, and reform, demonstrating the inseparability of economic and political dynamics. The Depression thus provides enduring lessons on the relationship between governance, policy, and societal well-being. In conclusion, the Great Depression was far more than a financial crisis. It was a human experience, a cultural moment, a political challenge, and a transformative episode in global history. It reshaped families, communities, economies, and governments, leaving legacies that continue to inform policy, social structures, and collective memory. From the Dust Bowl plains to urban shantytowns, from labor protests to artistic expression, the decade exemplified both vulnerability, resilience, despair, and hope. The lessons of the Depression remain vital, reminding us that economic systems are deeply interconnected with human lives and social structures, and that the strength of communities, policy, and governance determines the capacity to weather adversity. Thanks for watching The Other Side Stories. If you enjoyed this journey through history's hidden paths, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with fellow explorers. Your support helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Until next time, keep wondering about the past.